All right, everyone. So we had an issue with our 2008 Yukon where it was very common issue. I had done some work to the car, and it the battery had died enough so that the HVAC reset. And I think in the process of resetting, the blend door actuators travel their full distance, so lock to lock. And so there's a couple blend door actuators in this car. One controls hot and cold on the driver's side. One controls hot or cold on the passenger side. One controls the vent, the vent selector, whether it's low, high, defrost. And the one that had gone bad for us was the driver's side hot cold. So it's a summer here. We're both blowing cold air out of the passenger side and hot air out of the driver's side. This had happened before and corrected itself over time. So I actually think that the actuator is probably okay. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But I bought a new one and replaced it. It's very easy to replace. I'm not going to do a video on how to replace them. They're pretty simple to replace. You just remove a cover from this, and then the actuator is right there. You can actually see the white piece there is the piece that goes onto the door and activates it. So we replaced that, and I turned the car back on, and it worked fine, or it seemed to work fine. It was blowing cold air out of that vent, which made me think that it was working fine. In the process of doing that, I did the blend door actuator reset process, which you pull some fuses, you wait a couple seconds, you put the fuses back in, start the car up, and the HVAC will go to 74 degrees on both sides. It runs through a calibration process, and then it works. And everything seemed like it was working. We were getting cold air out there. I thought I'd even moved it to hot, and we got hot and then back. And then did some more work to the car, and it stopped working again. And in this case, what stopped working was the system would only blow cold air, and none of the settings here would work at all. So I'm still not quite sure how we got into this situation. Once I describe what caused it, you'll see why. But we were in a situation where no matter what you changed here, the only thing that would change is the fan speed. So the fan would go up. So if you go all the way hot, in our case, the fan would blow hot, the fan would blow full speed, but it would blow cold air out of the upper vents, even though it was saying it was trying to blow hot air out of the bottom vent. So just nothing was responding here at all to the inputs we were putting into it, except the fan. The fan would adjust. So if you look around online for symptoms like that, you run into all kinds of things. People end up pulling that cover off, which I did. I would advise you to not do that unless you're very convinced that it's a problem, because once you do, it's very hard to get back on. It snaps in place, but there's nothing supporting this piece. So I'm gonna have to pull the headliner somehow and get up in there to snap this back in. While I was there, I did clean out a bunch of junk. So this is the temperature sensor. It's the cabin temperature sensor. So some people say that if that temperature sensor is not reading properly, it won't send the proper signal to the HVAC control, and then the control just stops doing anything. I don't know if that's true or not. It didn't change anything for me, but I did clean that out while I was in there, which is great. So the problem we actually had after buying 3 actuators, my theory was that the actuator was not working, and the system was sensing that it wasn't working, essentially throwing an internal error and then not responding to any of the inputs. But as it turns out, that is not the problem. So I'm going to jump to the outside of the car, and I found this out after doing many resets of the system. So you can reset the system in 2 different ways. You can pull fuses, or you can just connect the battery for 10 minutes and reconnect the battery, upon which time when you start the car, it'll default all the controls to 74 degrees and we go through a reset procedure. And it seemed like it was doing that. It was definitely resetting, but it would never actually calibrate and adjust. And the reason is, simply enough, the reason, quite simply, was that this fuse, I'm going to point to it with my keys here, this fuse right here was missing. Okay, so if we look at the fuse here, this is the ignition, HVAC ignition is what it's called. I don't know why it was missing. I think in the process of testing, I had pulled it at one point, It's possible that when I put it back, I just didn't get it in place, and we drove since then and it wiggled out and fell away. I don't know. I think it was here at one point in all this mess, but it had since gone away. I had been pulling this one, which is the HVAC battery. This is the one that will put the system back into relearn mode. So if you pull this for 10 seconds, put it back in, it goes back into relearn mode. In researching all of this on all the forums, I found a guy who said, you got to pull this one and this one and this one. And so I started reading about what those were and realized that this one was missing. So put a new fuse in and everything works great. The blend door actuators are working. I now have 3 of them. I may test them to see if they were actually bad. In the process of researching this, apparently what happens with a lot of them is when you go through a relearn procedure, let me grab one here. When you go through a relearn procedure, the blend door actuator will actually clock itself all the way from the far side here to the far side over there. Even though the range of motion when it's in the vehicle is much less than that, it really only travels about 3/4 of that range. And inside of these, I'll do another video where I open them up. Inside of them, there is a contact point on this gear. Just 2 little prongs that ride along part of the chip, or part of the board, the electric board. And they send the position of the actuator back to the computer so it knows whether it's moving. And sure enough, when I opened the factory one that had been in there, I think since this was manufactured, so going on 16 years, it had a ton of grease built up at the end of that contact. And so the theory that some people have is that when your battery dies and these things go into relearn mode, they push all the way to the end of the range, pick up a ton of grease, and lose connection, which then throws an error to the system and all kinds of things go wrong. Either they stay stuck where they're at, they lock themselves out, or they just won't respond to any changes. So I think that's probably what happened. I'd had this symptom one other time. It had corrected itself. And so I'm assuming that, the battery dies. It tries to clock all the way out to the edge. It throws a fault. The system stops working. And then, do some more work on the vehicle. The battery dies again. It tries again. And that grease spreads around and it starts working again. So I'm going to keep the old factory one. I actually dug it out of the trash because I'm pretty convinced that it is still working. This is a cheap, it's not cheap, it's a Dorman replacement, but the Dorman replacement on Amazon are $120. Whereas I got another cheap replacement on Amazon for $25. You can pick up a factory one for $120 from Rock Auto. So I don't know. Well, this one is very easy to replace, so I don't really mind there being a cheap knockoff in there. If it lasts for 5 years, great. But I'm going to keep the factory one and try to tinker with it and see if it'll still work. So, anyways, that's it. If you have an issue where your lights come on the dash, but they do not respond to any of your inputs other than the fan changing speed, the symptom is, or the root cause is probably that second fuse, the 10 amp fuse right there, is probably missing. So apparently it gets power from the other fuse and this one, but it will not work if that fuse is not there. So make sure you add that fuse. Very dumb mistake. I was getting very frustrated with this vehicle. We just had a minor accident with it, and I was worried that something in the body control module had gone bad, or something more serious. But as it turns out, the simple answer is almost always the right one. So make sure you double check fuses and don't try to overcomplicate things. That's it.